In the United States today, some 75% of Black Americans identify as Christian. And the so-called Black Church, the informal coalition of Christian churches primarily attended and led by African Americans, has played a recognizable role in Black activism throughout United States history, from the anti-slavery movement of the 19th century to the civil rights struggle of the 20th, and more recently, the Black Lives Matter movement of the 21st. With this in mind, it may come as something of a surprise to at least some of you here today that the Black church played no recognizable role in the American Revolution. Indeed, that coalition, that concept of a Black church did not yet exist. I have thus titled my remarks for today, Before the Black Church, Religious Lives of African Americans in Revolutionary America. Many African Americans in the 1770s, perhaps a majority, were not even members of a Christian church. When war broke out between Britain and her American colonies in 1775, there were approximately 500,000 people of African descent living in British North America. The vast majority of them, some 90%, 450,000, were enslaved. Gender ratios, life expectancy and mortality, and more differed from one region to another. So too did the ethnic backgrounds of the enslaved, as well as their religious beliefs and identities. African Americans in 1775 spanned the spectrum of religious identity and included members of virtually every Christian denomination of the day: Anglican, Baptist, Congregationalist, Methodist, Moravian, Presbyterian, Quaker, Catholic, and so on. And there were also Black Muslims, Black Jews, and of course those who adhered to and practiced a variety of West and West Central African beliefs and rituals. The American Revolution would ultimately prove transformative to Black religious life in America and indeed beyond. It led in ways both directly and indirectly to the formation of the first independent Black Christian churches in the United States, marking the beginning of this Black church tradition I referenced before. It also strengthened the nascent anti-slavery movement in both the United States and the British Atlantic world. And like so many other participants in the American Revolution, people of African descent drew on their faith to build community, resist slavery, and ultimately pursue freedom. The beginnings of Black Christianity, though, predate the arrival of even the first Europeans to reach the Americas. Portuguese missionaries had, by the mid-15th century, that's the 1400s, introduced Catholicism to West and West Central Africa. In 1491, a year before Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, several prominent rulers in the Kingdom of Congo converted to Catholicism, and by the turn of the 16th century, the new King of Congo, christianed Alfonso I, had made Catholicism the established or state-supported church of his kingdom. Due in part to this alliance between Portugal and Congo, at least some of the captives sold into slavery and transported across the Atlantic Ocean arrived in America as baptized Christians. The majority of the 12.5 million enslaved who endured the Middle Passage between 1500 and 1850, of course, did not. And while Portuguese, Spanish, French, and Dutch colonizers sought to convert enslaved Africans in their American colonies to Christianity, the English proved more hesitant, or at least more conflicted. Individual missionaries did exist, as Kate mentioned, but their efforts were sometimes stymied by fears that conversion to Christianity would provide enslaved Africans with a legal route to freedom. Most enslaved Africans themselves likewise proved resistant or uninterested in the missionaries' message. That finally began to change in the late 17th century, when using baptism as a legal route to sue for one's freedom was legally overturned, and the early to mid-18th century, when renewed missionary efforts by the Church of England's Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, I don't know who was naming these things, but come on, okay? Together with proselytizing by upstart groups like the Moravians, New Light Congregationalists, Presbyterians, Methodists, and Baptists, began to finally make sustained inroads among Africans in British North America, including both enslaved and free. The revivals of the so-called Great Awakening both targeted and attracted individuals across the colony's racial, religious, and class divisions. And African Americans, both enslaved and free, began to show up regularly in the baptismal, marriage, and burial records of congregational churches in New England, of Presbyterian churches in the Middle Atlantic, and in Anglican, Methodist, and Baptist churches of Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. The religious experience of these proselytes was shaped by their location and their status as free or enslaved. In Massachusetts, for instance, where enslaved individuals made up a comparatively small percentage of the broader population, African Americans attended church alongside their white counterparts. While they sometimes were forced to sit in pews, physically segregated by race, at other times they worshiped alongside them. And for a few hours each week, enslaved Africans counted themselves as the spiritual equals of their enslavers and overseers. Further south, enslaved Christians, especially those living on large plantations, had their own services, with a white preacher preaching to them in a grove of trees or a hastily built chapel on an enslaver's property. Perhaps even more importantly, though, enslaved African Americans made time to meet far from the strict oversight of white preachers and white owners who chose to emphasize obedience as the fundamental law of Christian life. When Methodist preachers from England first arrived in Virginia's Tidewater region in the early 1770s, they found a receptive audience among many enslaved people there. In addition to their attendance at the preaching services of white preachers, they also met in clandestine class meetings, often late at night in secluded confines of the Great Dismal Swamp, far from the watchful eyes of owners and overseers. One early convert named Mary, a domestic slave in the home of a prominent Norfolk planter and county official, later described for so many nights in the week after having put her master and mistress to bed, taking her own child upon her back and going up into the country, and during the night assembling a number of other slaves and instructing them in religious matters. Others, including a young, charismatic convert named Moses, owned by a Suffolk merchant named Mills Wilkinson, likewise assumed a leadership role, functioning as a lay preacher to his fellow enslaved. These meetings constituted the beginnings of what historian Albert Raboteau famously labeled the invisible institution. These gatherings also proved formative to the development of the Black Christian Network that would ultimately shape the slaves' decisions when war reached their backyard. On November 7th, 1775, Lord John Murray, the fourth Earl of Dunmore and Royal Governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation declaring martial law in the colony and announcing that all indentured servants, Negroes, and others appertaining to rebels that are able and willing to bear arms, who joined His Majesty's troops as soon as may be, would be awarded freedom in return. Among the several thousand Black Virginians who successfully escaped to British lines in the months that followed was a tightly knit community of several hundred Black Methodists, whose numbers included Mary Perth and Moses Wilkinson. Linked by ties of both biological and spiritual kinship, the group had converted under the preaching of the first Wesleyan itinerants to reach the region. After a brief stint in Dunmore's Ethiopian regiment, battling both rebel forces and a deadly outbreak of smallpox, the surviving Black loyalists spent the majority of the war in British-occupied New York City. Charles Inglis, the rector of New York City's Trinity Church during the war, noted that attention to the Negroes has become the more necessary as some thousands of them have escaped to New York from the revolted colonies. Methodists likewise joined Anglicans in attending to the needs of these liberated Black African men and women. The Methodist John Street Chapel was located close to both the barracks that housed Black soldiers during the war and Canvastown, home to thousands of additional refugee slaves. With irregular leadership from white preachers, all licensed Methodist preachers from England had opted to return home at the beginning of the conflict. Black Methodists did what they had done in Virginia before, organizing themselves into classes and congregations and worshiping with or without white oversight. The Virginia Methodists in New York were joined there by other self-liberated African Americans from throughout the 13 colonies, as well as white Methodist loyalists and at least some still enslaved African Americans. John Street's worshipers notably included a black man named Peter Williams, who had been converted under the preaching of white Methodist lay preachers Philip Embury and Thomas Webb in the 1760s. At some point prior to the outbreak of war, Williams was sold to a man named James Amar, who worked as a tobacconist and trained Williams in the trade. Peter Williams met his wife, Molly Durham, at Methodist worship in New York City, and in 1780, the couple welcomed to the world their son, Peter Jr. When James Amar, a staunch loyalist, left for Canada in 1783, he sold Peter Williams to the trustees of the Methodist meeting in the city of New York. Negro Peter, as he was known in early records, was appointed sexton and undertaker of the chapel, a position for which he received a small remuneration, which he put towards periodic payments for the churches or to the church's trustees to eventually secure his own freedom. After the American Revolution, Peter Williams joined other black Methodists in New York City in petitioning Methodist Bishop Francis Asbury for permission to organize a separate Methodist congregation for blacks. Similar efforts in Delaware, Philadelphia, and Baltimore eventually resulted in the formation of the first independent black Methodist churches, namely the African Methodist Episcopal Church and the very similarly named African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Independent black Episcopal and black Baptist churches soon followed, laying the institutional groundwork for the black church that would prove so consequential in future decades and centuries of the American story. But black Baptists and Methodists also introduced their independent classes and congregations further abroad as well. Several thousand of the black loyalists living in New York City during the war left following the conflict and settled in the British province of Nova Scotia, where they were promised both freedom and land as compensation for their service during the war. There they faced discrimination, and many were denied their promised land grants. They again found solace in church, in Christian worship, transporting their classes and congregations across imperial lines and continuing to worship separately from their white Methodist counterparts. In the 1790s, as black Methodists in Philadelphia and New York were beginning to hold the first independent black Methodist worship services, most of the black Methodists in Nova Scotia left the colony and sailed across the Atlantic Ocean to Sierra Leone, an upstart effort by abolitionist-minded Englishmen. Once more, black Methodists, as well as black Baptists and Calvinist Methodists, known as Huntingtonians, transported with them their religious beliefs, practices, and organizational structures. The black church was thus an international effort, spurred by migration and movement, and forged during the American Revolution and its aftermath. But what of those individuals who remained enslaved over the course of the conflict? Those who were unsuccessful or who did not even dare attempt to flee and remained in Virginia or Maryland or South Carolina. Like their counterparts who did escape slavery, they took advantage of the war's disruption to declare their own independence in a variety of ways. In Fayetteville, North Carolina, a free black shoemaker named Henry Evans began to preach to enslaved African Americans with great effect. When local authorities interfered and prohibited from preaching, he withdrew to the sandhills out of town and held meetings in the woods, changing his appointments from place to place, thus skirting the letter of the law and eluding the town council. In Oxon Hill, Maryland, just across the Potomac River from Alexandria, Virginia, another group of free and enslaved African Americans built a small chapel and began holding weekly meetings. Their society is very numerous and very orderly, wrote one surprised white preacher upon encountering them. Even as this invisible institution persisted in the enslaved South, the boundaries separating it from the nascent black church, emerging at the same time in the North, grew increasingly blurry. By the early 19th century, the African Methodist Episcopal Church had begun making inroads as far south as South Carolina. What seemed to unite black Christians throughout wartime North America was a sense of themselves as participants in a sacred and divine history. Historian James Bird has observed that no biblical narrative was more influential or more diverse in its applications during the Revolutionary War than the story of Exodus and its intrepid, if inarticulate hero, Moses. But whereas white patriot ministers and politicians saw in the account a parallel between the case of Israel and that of America, and between the conduct of Pharaoh and that of King George, the formerly enslaved women and men fleeing their masters and meeting without their consent reversed that reading, pointing out the hypocrisy of equating taxes and lack of representation with slavery while continuing to hold others in bondage and to profit from their unpaid labor. In later reminiscences, black Methodists in both Philadelphia and Freetown framed their wartime experiences as their own search for a promised land. Imagining themselves as modern children of Israel, they compared their escape from slavery to that of their biblical predecessors, fleeing the oppression that King Pharaoh wherewith oppressed the Egyptians. African Americans drew upon their faith to not only survive the Revolutionary War, but also to find and make meaning of it. Thank you.